My brother poured gasoline around me, lit the match, and whispered, "Die like Mom." Flames roared up my hair, caught fire. Smoke choked me. I thought I'd die. But today he's in prison, and I am free. If you think this is just an ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now for more haunting episodes from us. Darkness. A deep, unyielding black filled the screen as a thin wail of wind curled into the silence, low and haunting. Somewhere in that dark, a faint tinkling of chimes began to stir. They whispered softly at first, then rose in the gust, their hollow metallic voice weaving with the distant echo of a single piano note. That note stretched, trembled, then fell silent again, replaced by a slow, mournful melody. The darkness lingered, clinging, holding the viewer in quiet suspense. Then the fade-in came slow, like dawn pulling away the edge of night. The camera opened to gray skies heavy with rolling clouds. Wind pressed through an old oak tree, shaking its black limbs over a graveyard hill that sloped down into mist. The grass was damp, clutching at a pair of worn brown boots standing before a freshly filled grave. The boots belonged to Kate. She stood alone, her black coat pulled tight against the cold. Her hair, long and chestnut, fell around her shoulders in heavy strands dampened by the morning drizzle. One trembling hand held a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped in thin brown paper. The other hand clenched so tight at her side her knuckles gleamed pale through the skin. The wind caught the edge of her coat, whipping it against her legs, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on the granite headstone before her. It was simple. Gray marble polished clean with an engraving that read, "Marian Elizabeth Turner, beloved mother, light of our lives." Kate's lips parted, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight raw from all the screams she had swallowed in the nights leading up to this morning. Her chest ached under the weight of everything unsaid. The lilies in her hand trembled with her shaking grip. Slowly, she knelt down, knees pressing into the cold, wet grass, and placed the flowers at the base of the headstone. Her fingers hovered for a moment over the carved letters, tracing the M with a fragile touch. The piano notes pressed deeper, each chord carrying a tension that threatened to crack the silence around her. She closed her eyes. The wind rushed harder, and for a moment she let herself feel it cut through her coat, soaking through to her bones. It felt like penance for all the moments she hadn't been there when her mother called out in pain. For the time she'd been at work, covering someone else's shift, thinking there would always be tomorrow. A memory surged. The piano faded under the rising beep of hospital machines. Kate was sitting on a hard vinyl chair by the side of a narrow hospital bed. Her hands, trembling then too, were folded in her lap. Her mother lay in the bed, sunken eyes looking up at the fluorescent lights with a vacant flicker of exhaustion. Oxygen tubes snaked around her cheeks, tugging at her paper-thin skin. Each shallow breath sounded like it was being pulled from far away. Kate reached out her fingertips, brushing against the blue veins on the back of her mother's hand. At the touch, Marian blinked her gaze, turning toward her daughter with effort. She smiled. It was small but warm, the kind of smile that said, "I'm still here with you, baby." "Mom?" Kate whispered, tears burning in her eyes as she leaned closer. The smell of antiseptic rust and wilted carnations from someone else's visitor tray filled her nose, but all she focused on was the faint lavender lotion scent still clinging to her mother's skin. Marian's eyes flickered again, this time sharper, as though she knew time was running out and words had to be said. She shifted slightly, grimacing with pain, and lifted her hand to brush against Kate's wrist. "Listen. To me, Katie." Her voice rasped thin as a moth's wing. "I signed. The papers. The ones in the brown envelope. For you. The house. The savings. They're yours, sweetheart." Kate felt her breath catch. She shook her head. tears spilling freely now. "Don't talk about that, Mom. Please. Just focus on getting better. We can talk about everything once you're back home." But Marian's eyes sharpened with a quiet urgency that cut straight through the denial. Her thin fingers pressed around Kate's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me, you'll check. The lawyer, after." Kate nodded quickly, brushing hair from her mother's forehead. I promise, Mom. Just rest now, okay?" Marian gave another smile, weak and fleeting, then closed her eyes. Her chest rose and fell in fragile rhythm as the monitor beeped steadily. The piano note faded back in soft at first, then gathering into a dark chord. The memory vanished, replaced by the cold graveyard again. Kate's eyes fluttered open. Rain clung to her lashes. Her breath fogged in the morning chill. Slowly she stood, knees aching, and looked up as a new presence stepped into her peripheral vision. Ethan. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a deep navy tie with a silver clip, and shoes polished so sharply they reflected the wet gravel beneath them. His hair was slicked back, revealing his square jaw and the smooth planes of his face. In his arms was a single rose held delicately between two fingers, like it was an accessory instead of a farewell. His eyes glistened with tears that didn't quite spill as he approached the grave. He made a sound, half sigh, half sob, then dropped the rose onto the fresh dirt and lowered his head. His shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. A murmur rose behind him as guests clustered nearby under black umbrellas, eyes shiny with shared grief. An older aunt reached out, rubbing Ethan's back as he buried his face in his hands. "Oh, Ethan. She loved you so much," the aunt whispered, her voice cracking. He shook his head slowly, then turned to face the small gathering eyes, red-rimmed and damp. His mouth trembled as he spoke. "Mom. Mom wanted me to take care of everything," he said, voice breaking perfectly in all the right places. She left the house to me. The savings. She knew I'd protect it. For all of us." A sympathetic wave rolled through the crowd. Nods. Hushed agreement. Another aunt dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Someone patted his shoulder, whispering, "She was so proud of you, Ethan." Only Kate stood still. The piano's low note returned, echoing beneath the scene. Her gaze didn't flicker. She watched him with an expression of exhaustion carved in stone eyes, dry and blazing. Her hand shifted in her coat pocket, fingers curling tighter around a small metal USB drive. She could feel its sharp edge pressing into her palm, grounding her in the moment. She said nothing. Her heart thundered so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest, but her face remained calm, almost serene. Ethan turned to look at her, their eyes locking across the short stretch of damp grass. For half a second, the mask slipped. His tearful expression faltered, and she saw the glint of steel in his eyes. The unspoken warning, the challenge, the silent threat that said, "Stay quiet. This is my stage." Kate's thumb rubbed across the USB's ridged edge. She let her gaze drift down to the grave, to the lilies now wet with drizzle, then back up to Ethan's face. Her eyes were no longer filled with grief. Only a quiet, focused rage glowed there. The kind of rage that burned slow, gathering power in the darkness. She inhaled sharply as the wind rose, carrying the piano's final haunted notes through the cemetery, sending her hair streaming sideways across her face. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply tightened her grip around the drive, feeling its cold certainty against her skin. Not today, she thought, but soon. The camera panned up, capturing Ethan, turning back to the guests, his tears returning on command. his arms outstretched to receive their pity and praise. Over his shoulder, the focus shifted back to Kate, a lone hair whipping across her determined eyes as she stood in the rain, unblinking, unbroken. The piano fell silent. The screen faded to black. The wind eased into a quiet lull as the funeral guests began to disperse, black umbrellas bobbing like wilted flowers under the gray sky. The camera pulled back from Kate's unblinking gaze, pivoting slowly toward Ethan, who stood a few feet away, still flanked by grieving relatives. His posture was impeccable, the crisp lines of his suit falling perfectly over his broad shoulders. He held his chin high as he nodded politely to each mourner who approached him. His hair, dark blonde and slicked back with meticulous precision, framed a face built for admiration. Angular jawline, high cheekbones, and eyes so blue they almost seemed unreal. There was a calm charisma about him, an easy smile that lit up in the exact right moments. Even in grief, his aura radiated quiet power, drawing people in with magnetic ease. "A true success story," an older man murmured as he walked past. "Look at him, managing the family business, building that real estate firm from nothing. Marion raised such a good boy." Another woman chimed in, her voice watery with tears. "Always so respectful, so polite. Every mother dreams of a son like Ethan." He gave them both a soft smile, lowering his gaze humbly, as though the praise embarrassed him. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking just slightly. "She deserved so much more than I could ever give." They nodded fervently, their eyes glistening with sympathy and admiration. As they walked away, Ethan's eyes flicked up, scanning the thinning crowd. The performance smile slipped for a microsecond, revealing something colder beneath, calculation strategy, before he caught himself slipping the mask back on with practiced grace. Behind him, a silver Lexus waited with tinted windows and spotless rims, an emblem of his carefully constructed success. Ethan had always been the golden child, even before his first six-figure promotion, even before the real estate empire bore his name in gold plaques on glass doors. He had always known how to stand where the light hit him best. A gust of wind rattled the tree branches overhead, rustling Kate's hair across her face as she watched him. Her eyes held no admiration, only a quiet, enduring exhaustion. She turned slightly away, her gaze falling to the wet gravel at her feet. If Ethan was the sun, warm and brilliant and blinding to anyone who looked directly at him, Kate was the shadow he cast behind. Her life moved in silence. Mornings at the small, independent bookstore downtown, where she arrived before sunrise to sweep the aisles and wipe fingerprints from the glass display cases. She knew the regulars by name: Mr. Carmichael, who always asked for Western thrillers; Ms. Rosa, who bought the same crossword puzzle books for her arthritis therapy. They all greeted her with the same distracted nods, never stopping to ask about her day. She spent evenings caring for her mother, cooking lentil soups, reheating casseroles she'd prepared on Sunday nights, organizing medication into daily pill boxes, brushing Marion's hair into a neat bun when her fingers grew too stiff to manage it herself. Kate's clothes always smelled faintly of books, dish soap, and lavender oil. Her hands bore thin calluses from stocking shelves and scrubbing floors. Her nails were clipped short and clean. Her hair was long and heavy, but always tied back in a low braid when she worked. Few people noticed her when she moved through the store or down the city sidewalks. And she had grown accustomed to that quiet invisibility. She used to wonder what it would be like to be seen the way Ethan was, to hear people say her name with admiration. But life had taught her the safety of shadows. Praise was fleeting. Expectations, she learned, could drown you. A memory flickered behind her tired eyes, drawing her back decades to a summer day steeped in sun and the sour smell of sweat and lemonade. She was 7. Ethan was 10. They were playing in the backyard, or rather she was playing and he was ordering. She remembered the sandbox warm and gritty under her small fingers as she built a tiny fort from plastic soldiers and damp sand. Ethan watched her from the porch steps, arms folded across his chest, eyes narrowed. "Give me that soldier," he demanded, pointing to the one she had just propped against a twig wall. Kate shook her head shyly. "I'm using him for the lookout tower," she whispered. His eyes darkened. He stood up and marched down the porch steps, boots crunching across the dry grass. Before she could react, he kicked the edge of the sandbox, sending her plastic fortress collapsing inward in a miniature landslide of sand and toppled soldiers. "Don't tell me no," he growled, bending down to snatch the soldier from her hands. When she resisted, his fist shot out, catching her across the side of the head. The blow wasn't hard enough to break skin, but it knocked her sideways into the sand, the world spinning around her in dizzying streaks of blue sky and yellow sunlight. Her ear rang. Tears welled in her eyes. She bit her lip to keep from crying out loud. The screen door slammed. Their mother's voice rang out sharp and anxious. "What is going on out here?" Ethan's demeanor shifted instantly. He dropped. The soldier gasped and dropped to his knees beside her. "Katie. Oh my God. Are you okay?" His voice quivered with manufactured panic as he brushed sand from her hair. "I didn't mean it, Mama." She fell over when she reached for my hand. "I swear." Marion rushed down the steps, worry etched into her sun-freckled face. She cupped Kate's cheeks, checking for bruises or bleeding. "Are you hurt, baby?" Kate shook her head silently, her eyes darting to Ethan. He stared back at her blue eyes, narrowing just slightly enough to send the silent message, "Don't you dare." Marion sighed, pulling Kate into her lap. "Be more careful, Ethan," she chided gently, but already her focus was on smoothing Kate's hair back from her forehead. "She's so small, sweetheart. You know you're stronger." Ethan nodded solemnly, lips trembling as he blinked away crocodile tears. "I know, Mama. I'm sorry." And Marion smiled through her worry, kissing his temple. "I know you didn't mean it. You're such a good boy." Kate sat perfectly still in her mother's arms, watching over her shoulder as Ethan wiped away his fake tears and smirked at her. It was quick, just a twitch of his lips before he schooled his face back into remorse. But she saw it. The smirk that said, "I always win." The memory dimmed, bleeding back into the present, where Ethan now stood in his pristine suit, thanking guests as they praised his devotion, his success, his kindness. The wind rose again, rattling the oak branches overhead. Kate shivered slightly, her fingers curling tighter around the USB in her pocket. He had always been the golden boy, the adored son, the savior of the Turner family name. She had always been the ghost in his shadow. But today she thought, feeling the hard edge of the USB dig into her palm, today the ghost was holding the only truth that could burn his golden kingdom to ash. The sky outside had turned a dim iron gray by the time Kate returned to her mother's house. The funeral guests had drifted away, leaving only the empty, hushed rooms, steeped in the stale scent of roses and old perfume. Shadows pooled in every corner. The air felt heavy, like it too was grieving. She dropped her purse by the front door and stepped out of her heels, pressing her sore feet against the worn wooden floorboards. Silence wrapped around her shoulders like an old quilt. With each step deeper into the house, memories unfurled. 1,000 moments woven into these walls, the cinnamon scent of her mother's morning oatmeal bubbling on the stove, the sound of radio jazz drifting into the living room, the low murmur of prayers whispered at dawn. She walked into her mother's bedroom, pausing at the doorway. The curtains were drawn open, letting in a thin silver light that fell across the neatly made bed. Her mother's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand folded atop a large print crossword puzzle book. The last clue she'd filled in read devotion. Kate's chest tightened. She moved to the old oak dresser, pulling open drawers, slowly careful not to disturb the folded sweaters and pressed handkerchiefs. At the very back of the top drawer, her fingers brushed against something stiff and papery. She slid it out. It was a sealed envelope. On the front, written in her mother's shaky cursive, was a single word, Katie. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper folded crisply. She opened it, eyes darting across the familiar loops of her mother's handwriting. My sweet girl. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry to leave you, Katie. I wanted to be here for you always, but God had other plans. I need you to know I left everything for you, the house, my savings. I spoke to Mr. Rollins at the bank and had him set it all up. You deserve this baby. You gave me everything these last years. I just hope this gives you something back. Love you forever, Mama. Her vision blurred. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks, splashing onto the edge of the paper. The letters wavered and dissolved in her sight. She pressed the note to her chest, sobs cracking through her ribs. For a moment her knees gave out and she sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning beneath her. Through her sobs she noticed a small blue plastic recorder tucked inside the envelope. She stared at it, confusion rippling through her grief. Slowly she pressed play. Her mother's voice crackled to life, thin and breathless, but unmistakable. Katie, it's Mom. I wanted you to hear it in my own words. I signed the house and everything over to you, baby. Ethan doesn't know. He'll be angry, but I couldn't leave it to him. You've been here. You've been everything. Please, don't let him take this from you. The recording ended with a faint sigh, then silence. Kate sat frozen, the tiny recorder clutched in her shaking hands. Her mother's words circled in her mind like vultures around a dying thing. Don't let him take this from you, she cried until her throat burned raw. The tears came in heavy waves, heaving sobs that shook her shoulders and made her curl forward, forehead pressed into her palms. Images crashed through her memory, each one sharper than the last. She saw Ethan standing in the living room months before, face red with anger as he shouted at their mother. What do you mean you can't give me the money? It's my inheritance, Mom, he roared, towering over Marion, who shrank back into her recliner eyes, filling with tears. I need it for the taxes for the house, she whispered. He slammed his hand against the wall so hard the family portrait rattled. This house is worthless, you hear me? You're just rotting away here anyway. Kate had stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a bag of groceries in her arms, her heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. She remembered the way her mother's eyes darted to her, silent and pleading, but neither of them spoke. That moment, and 100 like it, washed over her, now burning through her tears with molten clarity. The cruelty, the entitlement, the knowledge that her mother had been afraid in her own home. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, smearing tears and snot across her wrist. Her eyes, though swollen and red, glimmered with something sharp and unwavering. Kate stood abruptly, gripping the letter and recorder in one hand. Her legs felt unsteady as she crossed the room, shoulders brushing against door frames as though the house itself was trying to stop her. She grabbed her purse and coat from the entryway, jamming her arms through the sleeves with frantic urgency. She knew what she had to do. Mr. Rollins, the bank, the lawyer. She had to get there before Ethan discovered this letter was missing. She had to move before he smelled the threat in the air. She threw open the front door, stepping out onto the porch as cold wind slapped her tear-streaked face. The sun had sunk low, turning the sky to bruised purple. Shadows spilled long across the cracked driveway. She pulled her coat tighter around her and stepped forward, and froze. Ethan was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. He was leaning casually against the railing, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a cigarette that glowed like a tiny burning eye in the gloom. He raised it to his lips and took a long, slow drag, watching her through the curling smoke. Going somewhere, he asked, his voice deceptively soft. His eyes glimmered with mirthless amusement. Kate swallowed hard, her throat clicking in the silent dusk. I need to see Mr. Rollins. Ethan exhaled smoke in a thin stream from his nose. Mr. Rollins, the bank lawyer. His head tilted slightly. Why would you need to do that today, Katie girl? We've just buried Mom. It's insensitive, don't you think? She clenched her jaw, gripping the envelope tighter. I need to handle some paperwork. He chuckled softly, shaking his head as if scolding a child who had spilled juice on the carpet. Always so serious. Always thinking you know best. He flicked the cigarette onto the gravel, crushing it under his polished shoe. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them until she could see the small flecks of gold in his blue eyes. His hand reached up, brushing her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Listen to me, Katie, he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheek so lightly it almost didn't register as touch. I'm just trying to protect you. All this legal talk, the inheritance, it's messy. You don't want to get hurt. Let me handle it. For both of us. She felt her stomach clench, bile rising at the back of her throat. His eyes bored into hers, the gentle smile never reaching their icy depths. Please, she whispered, voice shaking. I need to do this. His smile widened slightly, though his hand dropped back to his side, curling into a fist. No, he said softly, his tone flattening into steel. You really don't. He stepped aside, gesturing back toward the house. Come inside. We'll talk. There's no rush. She hesitated, her body trembling with adrenaline. Every instinct screamed to run, to push past him, to jump in her car and drive to Mr. Rollins tonight. But as she met his unblinking gaze, the quiet threat vibrating under his calm demeanor, she knew what he was capable of if pushed. Slowly, she turned back toward the house, feeling his eyes burning into her back like twin laser sights. The door closed behind her with a hollow click that echoed through the empty rooms like a final tolling bell, and in her pocket the recorder pressed cold and small against her thigh like a heartbeat she prayed he couldn't hear. The morning after the funeral broke with a dull gray dawn pressing against the frost-glazed windows. Kate hadn't slept. Shadows clung under her eyes like bruises as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the small recorder in her hand. Her mother's voice felt like it was floating in the quiet air around her, filling the silence with both warmth and ache. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping back across the linoleum floor. She pulled on a thick navy cardigan, slipped the recorder into her purse, and left the house, locking the door behind her with trembling hands. The drive downtown passed in a blur of icy traffic lights and wet asphalt shining under early morning headlights. She barely noticed. Her mind was thrumming with urgency, her chest tight with adrenaline and fear. She parked outside the small brick building with gold lettering etched on the glass door, Charles and Gibbons, Public Notary and Estate Law. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered. The warmth of the office rushed over her, carrying the scent of coffee and old paper. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and tortoise-shell glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up and gave her a polite smile. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" he asked, voice soft but professional. Kate clutched her purse strap tighter. I need to check the records for a will. My mother, Marion Turner. She passed last week. I need to verify something. His smile faded slightly, replaced by careful neutrality. Of course. Do you have her death certificate and your identification with you? She fumbled in her bag, handing over the documents with shaking fingers. He glanced at them, typing into his computer as he squinted at the screen. Give me a moment. She stood awkwardly, arms crossed tightly over her chest, as she looked around the quiet office. Framed certificates lined the walls, all boasting accreditation and state approval. A pot of fake ivy trailed down from a high shelf, the only touch of green in the otherwise beige room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their sterile buzz drilling into her temples. The man finally cleared his throat, pulling a slim file from a nearby drawer and flipping it open. Yes, here we are. The will was signed 3 months ago. Ethan Turner is listed as the sole beneficiary, the house savings and all personal assets. Kate's heart dropped into her stomach. She swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a whisper. Could I see the signature page, please? He hesitated for a moment, then turned the file around and pushed it toward her across the counter. Her eyes darted to the bottom of the page. The signature was there, bold and confident, Marion E. Turner, but Kate felt a tremor of wrongness crawl up her spine. Her mother's signature had always been small, her hand weak and fluttery from arthritis. She leaned closer, tracing the smooth, flowing letters with her gaze. This was not the hand of a woman whose fingers shook while holding a spoon. Her breathing grew shallow. This isn't hers," she whispered. The man adjusted his glasses, studying her with cautious sympathy. "You're certain?" I signed her insurance paperwork last month with her. Her handwriting. It was barely legible. This is perfect. It's not hers." He drew back slightly, worry flickering across his face. He glanced over his shoulder toward the frosted glass door leading to the back office, then leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Miss Turner, I'm sorry, but if you truly believe there's been fraud, you need to contact a lawyer specializing in estate disputes. I can't officially comment, but this signature was filed under urgent priority. It was unusual." Kate blinked rapidly, a sharp sting behind her eyes. Urgent priority. Who filed it? He shifted uncomfortably. "Your brother handled the paperwork directly with my partner, Mr. Gibbons. I shouldn't say more." She opened her mouth to plead with him, but a movement caught his attention. His eyes flicked to the front door behind her, widening slightly. Kate turned. Ethan was standing just inside the entrance, the bell above the door still swaying behind him. He wore a dark wool coat over his tailored suit, a blue silk scarf draped loosely around his neck. His hair was immaculate as always, and his eyes glimmered with a bright, cutting smile. "Kate," he said warmly, his voice echoing too loudly in the small office. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The notary stepped back quickly, busying himself with a stack of files, his shoulders tense with discomfort. Ethan strode forward, placing a light hand on Kate's shoulder. She flinched under his touch. "Come on," he murmured, leaning down so close his lips nearly brushed her ear. "Let's not cause a scene here." He guided her firmly out of the office, his grip tightening when she tried to resist. The cold morning air slapped her cheeks as they stepped outside into the near-empty parking lot. He didn't let go until they reached the side of her car, where he spun her to face him, his hand pressing painfully into her upper arm. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed. The warmth gone from his voice, replaced by a jagged edge of fury. His eyes burned into hers, pupils narrowed to pinpricks. "Digging around, making accusations, trying to turn people against me. Do you really think this is what Mom would want?" Kate's voice shook. "Mom didn't sign that will, Ethan. That's not her signature. I saw—" He cut her off with a sudden violent shake of her shoulders that rattled her teeth. "Stop it. Just stop. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me. Do you think any of these people will believe you over me? Do you think they want to hear your pathetic little sob story when they could listen to me tell them about the house I'm renovating for a family in need? Or the charity gala I'm hosting next month for underprivileged kids? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a low, venomous whisper that only she could hear. Don't dig, Katie girl. Don't dig if you don't want to find something that will make you hate yourself for the rest of your life. Mom didn't want you to get hurt. Don't make her disappointment worse now that she's gone. He stepped back abruptly, smoothing his coat sleeves and straightening his scarf with quick, controlled movements. His expression returned to that polished public smile as he turned and walked away, his shoes crunching across the gravel. Kate stood frozen, staring after him until he disappeared around the corner of the building. Her chest heaved with ragged, silent sobs. The morning traffic roared in the distance, but all she could hear was the thudding of her own heart against her ribs. She drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles burned white. The house was dark when she entered, the quiet pressing in around her like an unwelcome embrace. She left her purse on the floor and collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with exhaustion and rage. Reaching into her coat pocket, she pulled out the small recorder again. Her thumb hovered over the play button. Her eyes burned with tears as she pressed it. Her mother's voice crackled into the room, filling the darkness with its thin, fading strength. Katie, don't trust Ethan, okay? He's not who he used to be. Promise me you'll protect yourself from him. Kate's shoulders shook as sobs tore silently through her chest. But beneath the grief, beneath the ache and fatigue, something hot and sharp began to spark in her gut. Anger, defiance, resolve. She closed her eyes, clutching the recorder to her chest like a talisman. I promise, Mom, she whispered into the dark. And with those words, Kate Turner decided she would no longer cower in Ethan's shadow. She would no longer let his threats keep her silent. She would fight, and this time she would not lose. The winter sun burned low in the sky, casting cold gold slashes across the empty highway as Kate drove south out of the city. Her pulse thudded fast in her neck. The recorder lay on the passenger seat, her mother's words replaying in her mind over and over, looping with a quiet desperation that propelled her forward. She pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of a small brown brick office with faded letters painted on the window. James T. Holloway, Estate Law. She remembered coming here once as a child, holding her mother's hand, staring up at the peeling paint on the trim while Marion signed papers inside. Back then it had felt like any other adult errand. Now it felt like stepping back into the battlefield of her mother's final unspoken war. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and old carpet. A humming heater in the corner pushed out weak warmth. James Holloway looked up from a pile of manila folders behind his scarred oak desk. He was in his early 60s with a bristly grey mustache and round glasses perched low on his nose. Recognition softened his tired features. Kate Turner, he said quietly, gesturing her in. I heard about Marion. I'm so sorry, dear. Kate swallowed the lump in her throat. She lowered herself into the cracked leather chair across from him. Her hands twisted together in her lap, nails biting into her palms. Mr. Holloway, she began, her voice trembling with urgency. I need your help. I found a letter from my mom. She said she left everything to me, the house, her savings. But Ethan, he filed a will claiming everything for himself. And I saw the signature. It's not hers. It's perfect. Too perfect. His bushy eyebrows furrowed as he leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long sigh. He reached for his mug and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her face. You're saying you suspect forgery? I don't just suspect it. I know it, she said, her voice breaking on the last word. But I don't have proof. I need to prove it. Is there any way to test the signature or the document? Something that will hold up in court. James set down his mug with a quiet thud and steepled his fingers under his chin. For a moment, he simply studied her, his gaze somber and heavy with unspoken truths. "There is," he said finally. "We can do a forensic handwriting analysis to compare known samples of your mother's signature to what's on that will." And he added, leaning forward slightly, "We can test for fingerprints. If your brother forged it, his prints may be on the signature line. It's rare, but if he pressed hard enough to trace or guide the pen, it might show." Hope flickered in Kate's chest, small but fierce. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. "Please," she whispered. "Help me. I'll pay whatever it costs." He shook his head with a weary smile. "Your mother. She was good to me for many years. Let me make a few calls. I know a forensic document examiner in Houston. He owes me a favor. But Kate..." His voice dropped lower, grave and cautious. "This will get ugly. Ethan, he's not the boy I once knew. You need to be careful." A cold shiver rippled down her spine. She nodded once, swallowing down the bile that burned the back of her throat. "I know." He stood rounding the desk to place a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. "Go home for now. I'll call when I've set up the appointment." As she left, the old brass doorbell jingled behind her. She stepped into the icy parking lot, a brittle wind whipping her hair across her eyes. She didn't notice the black SUV parked 2 rows behind her battered sedan engine, idling quietly, windows tinted against the winter sun. Inside that SUV, Ethan sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, wearing a dark wool coat and leather gloves that creaked softly when he curled his fingers around the steering wheel. His jaw was clenched, tight muscles ticking under his skin as he watched Kate walk to her car, head bowed against the cold. He waited until she pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the frontage road. Then he stepped out, boots crunching against salt-stained concrete. The wind caught the edge of his coat, flaring it around his legs as he moved swiftly to her parking spot. Kneeling down, he pulled a small black device from his pocket. A slim GPS tracker with a blinking blue light. He reached under the wheel well of her car and pressed it firmly into place behind the tire mount, fingers deft and practiced. The tracker beeped once, then fell silent. His lips curled into a cold, satisfied smile as he stood brushing invisible dust from his gloves. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his office, a glass of bourbon cradled in his palm as he watched the live feed on his laptop. A small red dot pulsed on the digital map, tracking Kate's location as she arrived home and parked in the driveway. He sipped his drink slowly, savoring the quiet burn down his throat. Behind him, the city skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights cold and distant against the black winter sky. On the desk in front of him, his phone vibrated with an incoming alert from the bug he had installed in her car, weeks earlier, a precaution he had almost forgotten until now. He tapped it open, raising an eyebrow as her muffled voice crackled through the tiny speaker. He said he knows a forensic examiner in Houston, testing the signature. Fingerprints. Ethan forged it. The recording fuzzed with static, then fell silent. He set down the bourbon and steepled his fingers, staring at the dark screen with eyes gone flat and empty. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, curling into a thin, humorless smile. "Forged it," he whispered to the empty office. His voice echoed off glass and marble, a low, hollow sound. "She really thinks she can win." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. His eyes glimmered under the recessed lights, reflecting a flicker of something dark and ravenous. He reached for his phone again and dialed a number from memory. It rang once before a man answered on the other end, voice thick and drowsy. "Yeah, it's me," Ethan said, calmly swirling the bourbon in his glass. "We have a problem. I need you to handle something for me. Discreetly. There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. Always discreet, boss. What do you need? Ethan's gaze drifted to the glowing map on his laptop, watching the red dot pulse steady in the darkness. Follow her, find out who she's meeting, and make sure she never makes it to that examiner in Houston. He ended the call and set the phone down gently beside his glass. The ice cubes clinked softly as he lifted the bourbon to his lips once more, the amber liquid catching the city lights like trapped fire. Outside, the wind howled through the steel and glass canyons, rattling window panes and sweeping through the silent streets below. And in the quiet of his office, Ethan Turner smiled into the darkness, his eyes glittering with a promise of ruin. The small forensic office sat tucked between a Payday Loans branch and a Vietnamese nail salon, its faded teal awning sagging under years of Texas sun. Kate stepped inside, heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the low hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. The scent of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner burned her nose as she approached the reception desk, clutching her mother's will so tightly her fingers ached. A receptionist in scrubs patterned with little cartoon syringes led her to a narrow hallway lined with dusty diplomas. At the end, behind a frosted glass door, sat Dr. Richard L. Bergman. His hair was silver and immaculately parted, his glasses rimless and perched delicately on a thin nose. He stood as she entered, extending a gloved hand with grave courtesy. "Miss Turner," he said in a calm baritone, "please come in." His office was orderly to the point of sterility. Magnifying lamps, fingerprint dusting kits, digital analysis tablets, and fiber optic scopes were arranged in perfect rows along the counter. He gestured to the worn leather chair across from his mahogany desk, then sat slipping on latex gloves with careful precision. "Tell me why you're here today," he prompted gently. Kate swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I need you to examine this will. I believe the signature was forged. My mother, she was too weak to sign like this. Her hand trembled even when she held a pen. He nodded once, taking the document with delicate care and sliding it under a glass examination plate. Pulling the lamp closer, he leaned forward, a jeweler's loupe pressed to his eye. Kate sat perfectly still, listening to her own ragged breathing in the quiet room. Her nails dug crescents into her palms. Each passing second stretched tighter and tighter, her chest constricting as if iron bands were cinching around her ribs. Finally, Dr. Bergman sat back. He removed the loupe and exhaled through his nose, fingers steepled under his chin. His pale eyes met hers, grave and measured. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice dropping lower based on my preliminary examination, "I estimate with roughly 90% certainty that this signature is not your mother's." The room seemed to tilt around her. Heat surged up her neck, filling her face with a dizzying flush. For a brief, shining moment, she felt the flicker of hope burst into flame in her chest. Proof. She finally had proof. 90%, she whispered, gripping the edge of his desk so hard her knuckles whitened. He nodded, expression solemn. "I'll need verified samples from her final year to complete a definitive analysis, but there are inconsistencies. The tremor patterns, the pressure points. It's too strong and fluid for an elderly woman with arthritis." Tears blurred her vision. She pressed her hand to her mouth, a choked sob slipping between her fingers. Relief flooded her so sharply she felt like collapsing right there on the cheap industrial carpet. But before she could say anything, Dr. Bergman's phone vibrated loudly against the polished wood desk. He frowned, slipping off one glove to answer it. "This is Dr. Bergman." She watched his face tighten, color draining from his cheeks as a voice spoke on the other end. His eyes darted to her, then away. His shoulders hunched forward as if caving under invisible weight. Yes, I understand," he said quickly, voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "Please, there's no need for that. I said I understand. He ended the call with a fumbling thumb and set the phone down with a quiet clatter. For a moment he simply stared at his lap, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. Dr. Bergman. Kate asked softly, dread spreading its cold fingers around her spine. What is it? What's wrong? He inhaled shakily, then met her eyes. The kindness was gone, replaced by fear and resignation. Miss Turner, I'm sorry. I can't help you. Her mind froze. She blinked at him, trying to comprehend. What you just said? I know what I said. He interrupted, his voice cracking. But I can't proceed with this analysis. My practice. My staff. Please understand. I'm truly sorry. The words struck like hammer blows to her chest. She sat in stunned silence as he gathered the document back into its folder and slid it across the desk toward her with shaking hands. I wish you the best, he whispered hoarsely. Her body moved on autopilot. She rose, took the folder, turned, and walked out of his office into the antiseptic hallway. Her tears blurred the diplomas on the walls, her shoulders shaking so violently she nearly stumbled against the doorframe. Outside, dusk had settled over Houston, smearing the sky with bruised lavender and ash gray. The air smelled of diesel and cold metal. She leaned against her car, pressing her forehead to the freezing roof, her sobs tearing silently through her chest. Her shoulders heaved with each broken breath. She wanted to scream, to punch the steel, to tear the sky open with her rage. But all that came out were quiet, ragged gasps. Across the street, a black SUV idled in the shadows. Ethan sat behind the tinted windshield, eyes cold and glittering under the dashboard lights. His phone vibrated in his palm, a single text from his security contractor. Job's done. Examiner's backing off. He smirked, rolling his neck against the leather headrest as satisfaction pulsed through him like morphine. Weak, he thought, watching Kate wipe her eyes with trembling hands. Predictable. She would never beat him. But then his smirk froze. Kate lifted her head. Tears still streaked her red cheeks, but her eyes were no longer glazed with despair. They burned. Even from across the street, Ethan could see the flicker of something feral ignite behind them. Her shoulders straightened. She wiped her face roughly, breathing slowing into sharp, deliberate exhales. She unlocked her car and climbed inside, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled his rearview mirror. He watched as she pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with a speed driven not by panic, but by fury. Within seconds, his own phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Kate text. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Face to face. No more lies. He stared at the message. His pulse thudded heavy in his neck. The fragile little mouse he thought he had crushed underfoot was standing back up, fighting back. He could almost admire her stubbornness. Almost. But admiration didn't matter. Only victory did. He tossed the phone aside, its glow illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw as he drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. His eyes narrowed, dark and glimmering with lethal calculation. This was no longer about inheritance or pride. This was about dominance, about crushing any spark of rebellion before it could light a blaze he could not control. Inside her car, Kate gripped the steering wheel until her fingers throbbed. Her reflection in the rearview mirror was pale eyes, swollen lips trembling, but behind the tears burned a rage so clear it steadied her breathing. No more, she whispered to herself, voice hoarse but resolute. No more hiding. No more fear. This ends now. Outside, Houston's skyline glittered against the dying violet sky, each flickering light a silent witness to the war rising in its streets. In that darkening city, two siblings sat in separate cars, hearts thundering with the same promise spoken in different tongues. This is not over. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt as Kate pulled up to the old Turner estate. Her headlights cut across the familiar red brick facade, illuminating the ivy crawling up cracked mortar and the sagging porch swing swaying gently in the cold breeze. The windows were dark except for a dim glow spilling from the dining room, flickering like a dying candle. She sat for a moment in the car, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, trying to slow her racing pulse. The recorder sat in her coat pocket, a small talisman that felt heavier than stone. She closed her eyes, inhaling the cold dampness of the night air, before stepping out and crunching up the gravel driveway. Inside the house felt cavernous and abandoned, echoes of a home that once held warmth, now replaced by a sterile stillness. Only the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the entryway broke the silence. She stepped into the dining room and saw him there, seated at the head of the long mahogany table. Ethan. He wore a black wool coat over his tailored suit. His tie loosened just slightly, as if to appear relaxed. A crystal glass of whiskey rested in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim light and glowing like molten gold. His eyes followed her as she entered, calm and almost amused. "Kate." He drawled, his voice smooth and warm like honey laced with arsenic. "I didn't think you'd actually come." She didn't answer. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. She reached into her pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the recorder. Her thumb hovered over the play button for a heartbeat before pressing down hard. Their mother's voice crackled to life, thin and frail but clear, filling the room with ghosts. "Katie, don't trust Ethan, okay? He's not who he used to be. Promise me. Promise me you'll protect yourself from him." The words hung in the stale air, vibrating between them. Ethan's smile flickered, his jaw tightening as his eyes darkened to a stormy slate. "Why?" Kate whispered, her voice shaking as tears welled in her eyes. "Why did you do it, Ethan? Why did you do that to her? To me?" For a fleeting moment, something almost human flashed across his face, a glimmer of guilt or grief. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, seething rage. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back against the polished hardwood with a scream of wood on wood. "You think you understand anything?" He snarled, his voice rising into a vicious rasp. "You think you know what it was like watching her waste away? Listening to her breathe through that fucking machine every night while this house rotted around her?" Kate flinched, her tears spilling over as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "She trusted you. She loved you." His eyes blazed as he stepped forward, his shadow swallowing her under the dim chandelier light. "She was weak," he spat. "She clung to this place like it meant anything. She would have let it all slip through her fingers and left us with nothing." He moved so fast she didn't have time to react. His hand swung out, cracking across her cheek, with a force that sent her sprawling onto the cold hardwood. Pain exploded across her face, white-hot and blinding. She tasted blood as she struggled to lift herself onto trembling elbows. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard his ragged breathing. She blinked up at him, tears mixing with blood, as the room spun in dizzying loops. His chest heaved under his coat, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Get up," he ordered, his voice flat and dead of emotion. When she didn't move fast enough, he reached down his fingers, biting into her arms as he hauled her to her feet. She stumbled, knees buckling under her, but he kept her upright with brutal force. He dragged her through the kitchen, the dark counters and gleaming appliances blurring past as tears streamed down her burning cheek. She tried to twist out of his grip, but his fingers only dug in deeper, bruising her flesh. He yanked open the basement door, the old hinges screaming in protest. The smell of damp concrete and stale mildew rose to meet them as he shoved her forward. She stumbled down the narrow wooden steps, catching herself against a shelf lined with dusty bottles of wine. She turned to face him, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. Fear pulsed through her veins like ice water. her heart thudding so hard it hurt. He descended after her, slow and deliberate, each bootstep echoing with ominous finality. From his coat pocket he pulled a length of rough, coarse rope. Her eyes widened, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as she shook her head frantically. "Ethan, please, don't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking as fresh sobs clawed up her throat. But his face remained cold and impassive eyes flat and empty as a shark's. He grabbed her roughly, forcing her wrists together and wrapping the rope around them with swift, practiced efficiency. The fibers bit into her skin, burning and scraping as he cinched the knot tight. He shoved her down onto the damp concrete floor. Her knees scraped against the rough surface, sending sharp pains shooting up her thighs. She looked up at him, eyes wide with terror, tears spilling freely down her flushed cheeks. He turned away, walking to a metal shelf near the old wine barrels. He reached behind a row of dusty Merlot bottles and pulled out a red plastic canister. The harsh chemical smell hit her instantly, making her gag, as he unscrewed the cap and began pouring gasoline in a wide arc across the floor. The fumes filled the cold air, burning her nostrils and coating her tongue with a sickly taste of oil and metal. Her vision blurred with tears as she coughed, her body trembling so violently she thought her bones might shatter. Ethan finished emptying the canister and tossed it aside with a hollow clatter. He turned to her, his eyes glinting with something dark and gleeful, as he pulled a small silver Zippo from his pocket, flicking it open with a metallic snap. "You should have stayed quiet, Katie girl," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. Now you're just another burden, another loose end." Her sobs turned to hysterical pleas. "Please, please don't do this. Ethan, I'm your sister, please." He crouched down in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his cold blue eyes. His smile was small and cruel, stretching thin across his lips as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. He stood abruptly, his boots scraping against the concrete as he flicked the lighter to life, the tiny flame dancing in the darkness like a devil's eye. The smell of gasoline thickened, coating the back of her throat with nausea as fresh tears streamed down her face. "Ethan, please." She choked out, her voice hoarse and broken. But he didn't hear her, or he chose not to. His eyes gleamed with savage triumph as he took a slow step back, the flame flickering between them, casting long, writhing shadows across the damp basement walls. And in that flickering darkness, Kate realized with bone-deep certainty he was going to kill her, and no one was coming to save her. Not this time. Cold air burned in Kate's lungs as she sucked in ragged breaths. The grass was wet beneath her cheek, mixing with the hot sting of blood trickling from the gash above her eyebrow. Around her the world blurred in a whirl of sirens, flickering blue and red lights bouncing off the charred brick walls of the house she once called home. Voices shouted overhead, firm clipped orders from uniformed officers cutting through the chaos. 2 paramedics knelt beside her, their gloved hands hovering over her torn and trembling body. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" one said urgently, shining a small flashlight into her eyes. Kate blinked against the harsh beam, her vision swimming with shapes and shadows. Her throat burned from Ethan's grip, each swallow slicing through her like razor wire. She tried to speak, but only a broken croak escaped her lips. "Clear a path," someone barked from behind the ambulance. "Get her on the gurney now." She felt the hard plastic backboard slip under her spine, the cold biting into the thin skin of her arms. Pain roared across her shoulders as they lifted her, strapping her down with brisk efficiency. Above the edge of the gurney, she saw the old oak tree in the front yard, its charred branches curling skyward like black skeletal fingers. And then she saw him. Ethan stood near the front porch, his coat flapping around his legs in the icy wind. His hair was mussed, a smear of soot darkened one cheek, but his posture was perfect. His hands held out to the 2 officers flanking him as if in surrender. His expression was one of quiet, wounded dignity, the grieving son caught in a tragedy he could not control, their eyes locked across the smoking ruins of their family home. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. All she saw was him, the brother who once shared her birthday cakes, who pushed her on the old tire swing in the backyard, who whispered threats in the dark when no one else could hear. His lips curled into a small, private smile, a smile meant only for her, a smile that said, "You'll never win." The officers began speaking to him, their voices low and respectful. She watched helplessly as he gestured to the house, to the ruined window where she had crawled out, bleeding and gasping. Tears blurred her vision as he lifted his hand to his mouth, pressing trembling fingers against his lips, like a man too broken to speak. Then he turned away from the police, his gaze sweeping the gathering crowd of neighbors, standing behind yellow caution tape. His shoulders hunched forward as if crushed by grief and shame. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a mix of sympathy and curiosity. She saw Mrs. Garner from next door, shaking her head sadly, wiping tears from her wrinkled cheek with trembling fingers. Mr. Daniels clutched his wife's hand, whispering, "Poor boy." First his mother, now his sister. Kate tried to scream, tried to force out the truth from her burning throat, but her voice came out in nothing more than a broken animal rasp that was swallowed by the crackle of radios and the whirring of emergency lights. They loaded her into the ambulance, strapping an oxygen mask over her face. The door swung shut with a dull metallic thud, sealing her in darkness. She stared up at the ceiling, feeling the rumble of the engine beneath her battered body as the ambulance pulled away from the curb. Through the small back window, she watched Ethan's silhouette grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely into the swirling chaos of flashing lights and drifting smoke. At the hospital, fluorescent lights burned overhead as nurses wheeled her down sterile white hallways. Machines beeped in steady rhythms around her, measuring heartbeats, oxygen levels, pain. A young doctor with cropped black hair and tired eyes leaned over her, stitching the wound on her forearm with quick, precise movements. Each pull of the needle burned hot along her skin, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her mind was far away, replaying every moment in that basement. The smell of gasoline, the flames licking up the walls, Ethan's voice whispering death into her ear. When it was over, they left her alone in a dim recovery room, the curtain pulled half closed. The soft hum of the heating vent filled the silence. Kate stared at the ceiling tiles, her thoughts roaring with everything she couldn't say aloud. Minutes or hours later, she wasn't sure, the curtain rustled open. 2 police officers stood there, their badges catching the pale yellow lamplight. Behind them loomed Ethan in a navy wool coat, his tie loosened in performative fatigue. His eyes glistened with tears unshed. The taller officer spoke first. "Miss Turner, we need to ask you a few questions." Her gaze flicked to Ethan. He looked down at her with soft pity. His lips pressed into a thin line of worry. To anyone else, he looked like a brother shattered by grief. But in his eyes, behind the tears and the mask, burned a cold, triumphant blaze. "Officers," he said quietly, his voice breaking beautifully on each syllable. "Please, go easy on her. She's not well. She hasn't been well since Mom passed." The words sliced through her like blades. Her chest heaved as she shook her head weakly, the oxygen tube tugging at her nostrils. He tried to kill me," she rasped, her voice shredded and small. The shorter officer frowned, glancing at Ethan with uncertainty. But Ethan stepped forward, his shoulders trembling as he knelt by her bedside. "Katie," he whispered, just loud enough for the officers to hear, "It's okay. It's okay. I forgive you." He reached out and took her trembling hand in his, squeezing it gently. His skin was warm, his grip tender. To the officers, it looked like love. To Kate, it felt like the tightening noose of death itself. "Don't, please." She gasped, tears spilling down her temples into her hairline. "Miss Turner," the taller officer said, his tone soft but firm. "We found gasoline on your clothes and burns on your arms consistent with setting the fire. We have to ask, did you intend to hurt yourself tonight?" "No," she croaked, shaking her head as hard as her aching neck would allow. He did it. Ethan squeezed her hand tighter, tears finally spilling from his blue eyes. "Katie, please, don't do this to yourself. Don't make them think you're dangerous. Just tell them the truth." And in his gaze she saw it, the final silent command, stay silent or die. A sob tore from her chest as the room spun and darkened at the edges. She felt her grip on reality slipping as the painkillers surged through her bloodstream, dragging her down into thick, suffocating blackness. The last thing she heard was Ethan's quiet, broken voice murmuring to the officers, "She needs help. She just needs help." Then darkness swallowed her whole, and the only thing left was the echo of her mother's fading voice in her memory, whispering a promise Kate wasn't sure she could keep. "Don't let him take everything." But as the machines beeped steadily in the dark, and Ethan's cold hand held hers like a vice, she realized with bone-deep certainty he already had. Red and blue lights fractured the darkness like shattered jewels as police cruisers screeched to a halt along the curb. Their headlights swept across the scorched grass, illuminating the rising columns of smoke curling from the basement window. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and gasoline swirling through the chill of pre-dawn. Kate lay sprawled on her side near the splintered back fence chest, heaving with ragged, whistling breaths. Blood dripped steadily from the gash across her forearm, mingling with soot and dirt. Her hair clung in damp, matted clumps to her tear-streaked face. She felt each beat of her heart as a dull, distant thud disconnected from the rest of her body. Her eyes fluttered half open, seeing nothing but streaks of flashing color and shadowed silhouettes moving through the smoke. Boots pounded the frozen ground around her as officers fanned out weapons, drawn voices shouting commands in clipped bursts over the crackle of radios. "Clear the yard. Medic to rear entry. Female victim down. Repeat. Female victim down. Suspect located. Northeast corner." She felt rough but careful hands slide under her shoulders, lifting her onto her back. The sudden shift made pain bloom bright and hot across her ribs. A strangled cry escaped her cracked lips. "Easy, ma'am. Easy," a voice said close to her ear, warm and solid against the chaos. "Stay with me now." "Okay. What's your name?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her tongue felt swollen, her throat raw from screaming and smoke. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, streaking down into her hairline. Her gaze drifted past the paramedic crouched over her to where two officers wrestled Ethan to the ground near the charred basement window. They pinned his chest to the mud, wrenching his arms behind his back with swift, brutal efficiency. His face twisted against the wet earth teeth bared in a snarl as he bucked against their grip. "Don't fucking touch me!" He spat, his voice sharp with rage and edged with wild panic. "You idiots have no idea who I am." "Stay down," one of the officers barked, driving a knee into his spine to keep him pinned. Even as they cuffed his wrists and yanked him roughly to his feet, Ethan's rage burned away, replaced with something colder, something smug. He rolled his shoulders back, ignoring the mud dripping from his chin, and let out a low, humorless laugh. His eyes flicked over the gathering neighbors, over the EMTs hauling equipment from their trucks, and finally settled on Kate. He smiled. It was a lazy, satisfied smile that stretched across his bruised cheek, splitting the dried blood at the corner of his mouth. His chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled breaths as he shook his head slowly, pityingly. "Look at you," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the muted cacophony of radios and urgent commands. "On the ground again, bloody and pathetic, just like you've always been. An officer shoved him forward, but he dug his heels into the dirt, refusing to move until he finished what he wanted to say. His eyes locked on hers, glinting with a savage triumph that made her stomach churn with nausea and terror. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" He sneered, his lips curling back from his teeth. "You think these people care about your little sob story. I'm Ethan Turner. I took care of Mom when you were too busy playing martyr at your stupid bookstore job. I paid her bills. I kept this house from falling apart." His voice broke into a brittle laugh, sharp and echoing in the quiet that fell around them. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably behind the police tape, their eyes flicking from his bruised, cuffed body to Kate's crumpled, bloodied form on the grass. "I'm the hero here," he spat, glaring at the officers gripping his arms. "She's nothing. She's always been nothing." Kate's vision blurred with tears. She felt her chest tighten, grief and rage and humiliation coiling together like barbed wire around her ribs. She opened her mouth, desperate to scream at him, to scream the truth to anyone who would listen, but her voice came out in a weak, broken whisper that no one heard. Then a shadow fell across her face. Blinking against the swirling red-blue lights, she saw a man kneeling down beside her. The paramedics parted for him with quiet deference. He wore a dark wool coat that billowed slightly in the cold wind, and his eyes were shadowed under the brim of his cap. When he leaned forward, she recognized him. Her mother's old lawyer, Mr. Holloway. "Kate," he said softly, his deep voice cutting through the haze clouding her mind. "It's okay. I'm here. Can you hear me?" She blinked, hard tears spilling fresh down her temples. Her lips trembled as she forced the words out, every syllable scraping her throat raw. "USB," she croaked, her voice breaking around the syllable. "My purse. Inside. USB. And the recorder. Please." His brows furrowed in confusion for a moment before realization flickered across his face. He glanced quickly over his shoulder at an officer standing guard near the ambulance. "She's trying to say something about evidence," he called out, his voice low but urgent. "Check her purse for a USB and recorder. Now." Kate felt the blackness pressing at the edges of her vision, heavy and suffocating. Her chest heaved with each ragged, shallow breath as she tried to focus on Mr. Holloway's face. His hand slipped into hers, warm and solid. "Don't worry," he murmured, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll make sure they get it. I promise." She tried to smile, but her lips barely twitched. Tears pooled in her hair as her eyes rolled back, the swirling lights fading into a distant blur of color and shadow. The world grew silent except for the roaring pulse of her blood in her ears. Her mother's voice whispered faintly through the darkness as her consciousness slipped away, warm and soft, like it had been in the quiet mornings before sickness claimed her. "Don't let him take everything." With her last flicker of strength, Kate exhaled a shaking breath, letting her heavy eyelids flutter closed. Her fingers curled weakly around Mr. Holloway's, clinging to the promise of a truth she could no longer speak. And then the world fell away, leaving only darkness and the faint echo of sirens wailing into the dawn. The morning of the trial dawned gray and sullen, the heavy clouds pressing low over the courthouse dome like a warning. Outside, reporters gathered in tight clusters along the front steps, their cameras trained on the ornate wooden doors, microphones bristling in the cold breeze like a forest of steel reeds. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with hushed voices and the rustling of suits and paperwork. Spectators filled every bench, their faces solemn and expectant. Court officers in navy uniforms stood at intervals along the paneled walls, their eyes scanning the crowd with quiet vigilance. The oak benches gleamed under the fluorescent lights, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the solemn faces staring ahead. Then the heavy doors swung open. Ethan entered, flanked by two uniformed deputies. his wrists cuffed loosely in front of him. He wore a tailored black suit, the cut so sharp it looked like it could slice bone, with a pale silver tie knotted precisely at his throat. His hair was combed back with meticulous care, accentuating the cold, angular lines of his face. Under the harsh courtroom lighting, his blue eyes glittered like shards of ice. The room seemed to shift as he walked down the aisle, a subtle ripple of reaction passing through the benches. Journalists' pens scratched faster across their notepads, and camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, capturing each measured step, each flicker of his expressionless gaze. To them, he was a story. Tragedy, greed, inheritance, violence, wrapped in one handsome, menacing package. Ethan's lips twitched with the ghost of a smile as he reached the defense table. He sat down slowly, smoothing his suit jacket with deliberate precision before lifting his chin to scan the room. His gaze passed over the judge, the rows of silent strangers, and finally landed on Kate. She sat at the prosecution table, her shoulders' rigid hands clenched together so tightly in her lap that her knuckles blanched white. Her face was still bruised, a faint yellow shadow curling along her cheekbone where his fist had struck. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, exposing the fading burn scars along her neck. Despite her trembling hands, her eyes never left his. For a moment their gazes locked. Brother to sister, predator to prey, one final battlefield between them. He tilted his head just slightly, giving her a smile that didn't touch his eyes. A smile that said, "You've already lost." The bailiff called the court to order, his voice echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Chairs scraped against the tile floor as everyone rose. The judge entered, robes billowing behind him, and settled into his high-backed leather seat with a solemn nod. "Be seated," he said gruffly, peering over his spectacles at the attorneys on either side. "Proceed." Kate's lawyer, Mr. Holloway, stood. His graying hair was combed neatly to the side, and his pinstripe suit fit slightly too loose across his thin shoulders. But his eyes burned with a quiet, unyielding resolve as he approached the podium. "Your Honor, we submit into evidence an audio recording recovered from Miss Turner's personal belongings," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "It is a recording made by her late mother, Marion Turner, shortly before her death." He clicked play on the laptop hooked into the courtroom sound system. The speakers crackled with static for a brief moment before Marion's voice filled the chamber, thin and trembling but unmistakably clear. "Katie, don't trust Ethan, okay? He's not who he used to be. Promise me you'll protect yourself from him." The words hung in the silent room like drifting ash, landing heavy on every bowed head and widened eye. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, the sound of disbelief and quiet horror. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across notepads like dry leaves skittering across pavement. At the defense table, Ethan leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was not a forced or embarrassed laugh. It was low and rich and genuine, a laugh that curled his lips back from his perfect teeth and lit his cold blue eyes with savage amusement. He shook his head, chuckling under his breath, as though the world's greatest joke had been told just for him. When his attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, Ethan waved him off with an impatient flick of his wrist. He turned his gaze to the judge, still smiling broadly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and honeyed, carrying easily through the stunned courtroom. "Am I really expected to dignify this sentimental nonsense? A dying woman's ramblings. My mother loved me. Everyone knows that. I was her caretaker, her rock." He gestured to Kate without looking at her, his eyes still locked on the judge. "She's just sick. Always has been. Even Mom said so. Check the hospice records." Kate's breath came in short, uneven gasps. The world around her blurred, the walls and benches and cameras fading into a swirling gray fog. Her lawyer said something, his voice distant and muffled in her ears. Ethan's laughter echoed inside her skull, sharp and taunting. She felt her chest tighten, her ribs straining against the sob that threatened to tear free from her throat. Then she felt it, the thin edge of the photograph tucked into her blazer pocket. The glossy paper burned against her fingertips, like a brand grounding her in the moment, slicing through the swirling fog of grief and fear. She curled her fingers around it, feeling the tremble in her hands, still into a cold, deadly calm. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. The room quieted instantly, all eyes shifting to her thin, trembling frame. Her knees knocked together as she stepped forward, her heels echoing across the polished tile like a funeral toll. She didn't look at Ethan as she reached into her pocket. Her gaze was locked on the judge, her lips pressed into a thin line to stop them from shaking. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the photograph and held it up for the court to see. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A reporter dropped his pen. An older woman in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. In the grainy hospital photo, Ethan stood over their mother's hospital bed, his hand fisted in the collar of her nightgown. Her thin shoulders curled inward in visible pain. A dark bruise blossomed along her jawline, stark against the pallor of her wasted face. The timestamp in the corner marked it just 3 months before her death. Silence crashed down like a thunderclap. Ethan's smile froze on his lips, his eyes flicking from the photo to Kate and back again. For the first time, his expression cracked. Beneath the polished veneer, panic flickered across his eyes, fleeting but real. Kate's voice trembled as she spoke, each syllable laced with grief and quiet fury. She wasn't rambling, she whispered into the silence. She was begging. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the only sound the distant ticking of the judge's ornate clock counting down the final seconds of Ethan Turner's lies. And for the first time in her life, Kate felt the weight on her chest lift just enough for her to breathe. For a hot beat, silence clung to the courtroom like thick fog. The photograph still hovered in Kate's trembling grip, her thin arms quivering under its weight. Across the aisle, Ethan sat frozen in his chair, his lips parted just slightly, as if words had caught in his throat and refused to come out. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. The cold arrogance in his eyes flickered, replaced for the first time with something raw and unmasked fear. Then the silence shattered. "You stupid bitch!" he roared, surging to his feet so violently his chair clattered backward onto the polished tile. His voice cracked and broke high and wild with rage. "You think this makes you better than me? Huh? You think anyone fucking cares about her, about you?" His hands slammed down onto the defense table with a deafening crack, rattling the water glasses and scattering his lawyer's papers across the floor. A reporter yelped in shock as the bailiffs moved in their boots, pounding across the courtroom floor. She was pathetic. Ethan screamed, spit flying from his lips as his face flushed deep crimson. She was a burden. You hear me? A fucking burden, always crying about bills and pain and needing help. His voice broke off into a choked, hysterical laugh. Tears streamed down his flushed cheeks as he threw his head back, the sound bubbling from his throat, half sob, half scream. He lunged forward again, fists clenched, veins bulging along his neck. "And you," he spat, glaring at Kate with eyes so wide the whites gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. "You worthless little nothing. Working in that stupid bookstore, wiping Mom's drool, thinking it made you a saint. You were nothing then. And you're nothing now. Two uniformed bailiffs grabbed him from behind, pinning his arms to his sides as he thrashed violently, kicking out at the overturned chair. His knees buckled under their grip, and they forced him down, cuffing his wrists behind his back with swift, brutal efficiency. His screams dissolved into guttural sobs, his body shaking with each ragged breath. I did everything. He gasped, his voice breaking as they hauled him upright. I kept this family together. I kept us alive. She was supposed to love me. She was supposed to love me. His chest heaved as he tried to suck in air between broken sobs, his eyes wild with grief and rage and a frantic, helpless confusion. Spit clung to his lips as he twisted in the bailiff's grip, his gaze darting around the silent courtroom as though searching for a single pair of sympathetic eyes. But there were none. At the judge's bench, the old man in black robes watched with solemn, weary eyes. He folded his hands together, the deep lines on his face etched with grave finality as he spoke. "Mr. Ethan Turner," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the hushed chamber like a bell toll. "This court finds you guilty of elder abuse, document fraud, attempted murder, and aggravated assault." Ethan let out a choked, incredulous laugh, shaking his head so hard his hair whipped across his flushed face. No, you can't. You can't do this to me," he gasped, his knees giving out as the bailiffs tightened their grip. "I'm all she had. I'm all she had left," the judge continued unmoved. "Given the severity of your crimes, your lack of remorse, and the premeditated nature of your actions, this court sentences you to 25 years in state prison without possibility of parole before the first 15 years are served." The gavel cracked down with a sharp final strike that echoed through the silent courtroom, vibrating up through the polished oak floors and into Kate's trembling bones. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze around her. All she could hear was the harsh, broken sobs tearing from Ethan's chest as the bailiffs dragged him backward toward the heavy double doors. His shoulders heaved, his cuffed hands trembling with futile rage. As they reached the threshold, he twisted his head to look at her one last time. His eyes burned with hatred, wet and feral and wild. His lips curled back into a twisted snarl, the cords of his neck standing out like steel cables as he screamed. "This isn't over, Katie girl," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I'll find you. You hear me? I'll find you." The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, swallowing his screams into the quiet hallway beyond. Kate sat frozen in her seat, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Her fingers clutched the photograph, still the edges cutting into her trembling palms. Around her, the courtroom stirred back to life. Reporters whispering urgently into microphones, court officers murmuring into radios, the low buzz of humanity returning like the tide. But Kate heard none of it, her vision blurred with tears as she stared down at the photograph in her hands, the image swimming in a wash of pain and memory. Her mother's frail face gazed up at her from the glossy paper, bruised and tired, but still so achingly familiar. Her throat clenched around a sob as the first tear splashed onto the photo, smearing across Ethan's blurred silhouette behind her. She didn't feel victory. There was no triumph burning in her chest. Only a deep, aching sorrow that hollowed her out from the inside, leaving behind nothing but echoes and ashes. Because today she hadn't just lost a brother. She had buried him forever. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed the photograph to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her heartbeat thundered against her ribs, each ragged inhale scraping through her lungs like glass. The pain throbbed deep and hot in her chest, radiating out through her limbs until even her fingertips burned with grief. Around her, people whispered. Strangers who didn't know her, who would carry her name for a day before forgetting it again. But none of that mattered. None of them could feel what she felt. None of them could understand that no matter what he had done, no matter how cruel his hands or how vile his words, there was a part of her that would always remember him as the boy who pushed her on the swing, who carried her backpack home in 2nd grade, who told her monsters weren't real. The tears fell faster, hot and silent, because the monster had always been real, and he had always been her brother. The morning after sentencing dawned clear and cold, the sun rising over the Turner estate one final time. Reporters clustered at the iron gate, their vans lined along the curb satellite dishes, pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers. Cameras flashed as neighbors walked their dogs past the scene, some slowing down to watch others hurrying by with eyes cast to the pavement. Ethan Turner, former real estate magnate, sentenced to 25 years for fraud, elder abuse, and attempted murder. A young female reporter announced into her microphone, her breath fogging in the icy morning air. Community members are reeling as details emerge about years of manipulation and violence hidden behind the walls of this home. Kate watched it all from the upstairs window. Her fingers curled around a chipped porcelain mug of black coffee gone cold hours before. Below her, men in navy work shirts were loading boxes into a moving truck, their footsteps echoing against the silent driveway. The wind rattled the brittle dead ivy against the brick siding like skeletal fingers scraping for purchase. She turned away from the window as her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Another message from a neighbor she hadn't spoken to in years. "I'm so sorry, Kate. We never knew. We thought he was always so polite at church potlucks." Another pinged moments later. "If you need anything, meals a place to stay, please reach out. We feel so ashamed we believed him." The words blurred on the screen as tears welled in her eyes, burning hot and sharp. Not tears of grief this time, but something quieter, something like release. She let them fall silently down her cheeks as she set the phone aside. She walked room to room barefoot on the worn hardwood floors. Her footsteps echoed off the empty walls, bare now of family photos and quiet memories. In the living room, dust motes drifted through golden shafts of morning light. She paused by the fireplace mantel, pressing her fingertips to a faint smudge where a framed photo once sat. Her mother smiling arms around her shoulders, Ethan standing behind them with his perfect smile and glittering eyes. She let her hand drop. Later that afternoon, she sat in the office of Holloway and Associates, signing the final paperwork with calm, unhurried movements. Her lawyer sat across from her, glasses perched low on his nose, watching her with quiet solemnity. "This will transfer the house sale funds directly to the foundation account," he said, gently sliding the final page toward her. Are you sure about this, Kate?" She met his gaze, her eyes clear and unwavering. "It's what she would have wanted," she replied softly. "It's what she deserved." She pressed the pen to paper, her signature looping steadily along the line Catherine L. Turner. The ink dried instantly on the thick cream stock. With that final mark, the house was no longer hers. The burden of brick and blood and memory lifted from her shoulders, leaving behind an emptiness that felt startlingly light. Outside, the city moved in slow golden waves beneath the sinking afternoon sun. Her cab dropped her off at the small bank downtown. Inside, she waited in line behind tired office clerks cashing paychecks and mothers depositing child support. When her turn came, she stepped forward, handing over the certified check from the house sale. "I need to deposit this," she said, her voice calm and certain, "into the newly established Ann May Foundation." The teller, a young man with dark hair curling at his collar, blinked and glanced at the paperwork before nodding quickly. "Of course, ma'am. That's a beautiful name." Kate smiled faintly, her chest aching with quiet warmth. "It was my mother's name in Vietnamese. It means mother's light." He smiled back, typing swiftly as the numbers appeared on his screen, a sum large enough to build something lasting. Something that mattered. Something untouched by Ethan's greed. As she left the bank, The last light of day slanted between the tall buildings, illuminating the streets in bands of molten gold and dusky blue. The winter air was crisp against her cheeks, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. She walked without thinking, her boots scuffing across the cracked sidewalks, until she reached the city park. The iron gates stood open, darkening ivy curling around their bars. She slipped inside, following the winding gravel paths past frozen rose bushes and bare sycamore trees, until she reached the hill that overlooked the river. The sun hovered just above the horizon, painting the sky in wide strokes of vermilion and violet. The water shimmered below, reflecting the dying light in trembling ripples. Wind whispered through the skeletal branches, rattling the last dead leaves in a quiet song. Kate sat on an old wooden bench at the top of the hill. Its paint was peeling, the metal arms rusted with age, but it held her weight as she curled her hands around her knees, tucking them close to her chest. Her hair fell forward, hiding her face from the handful of joggers and dog walkers passing behind her. She breathed in the icy air, tasting its sharp purity on her tongue, feeling it clear her lungs and settle cold and clean into her chest. The pain was still there, a dull throbbing ache in her ribs and wrists, a deeper ache in her heart. But for the first time she let herself sit with it. She didn't run from it or bury it under lists of chores or silent tears behind closed doors. She let it wash through her, cold and sharp and real. The sun slipped lower, the horizon glowing molten orange as shadows pooled across the park. A breeze lifted strands of her hair, brushing them across her cheeks in a tender caress that felt almost like a mother's touch. Kate closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely warm against her cold skin. But when she opened them again, she was smiling. It was small, just a slight upturn at the corner of her mouth. But it was real. It was hers. She tilted her face to the sky, watching as the first stars pricked through the darkening velvet above. Her breath fogged before her, fading quickly into the deepening dusk. And for the first time since her mother's death, since Ethan's betrayal, since the fire and the screams and the courtroom's cold justice, her heart felt quiet. Not empty, just quiet. She closed her eyes again, feeling the earth solid beneath her feet, the wind lifting her hair, the last warmth of the dying sun on her upturned face. And there, in the gathering dark, Kate Turner whispered a silent promise to herself, and to the memory of the woman who raised her. I'm free. The evening sky was a deep cobalt when Kate returned to the small rented apartment she now called home. Streetlights flickered on outside the window, bathing the living room walls in pale amber glow. She set her bag down gently by the door and unwrapped the gray wool scarf from around her neck, folding it neatly on the worn entryway table. She walked into the kitchen, switching on the dim overhead bulb. Its yellow glow illuminated the single-framed photograph leaning against the backsplash. Her mother's gentle smile gazed out from behind the thin pane-of-glass eyes crinkled in quiet joy, her sun hat casting soft shadows across her cheeks. Kate reached out, fingertips brushing against the smooth glass. A memory unfurled in her mind, slow and tender, blooming warm in her chest like the first crocus of spring. She was 16 again, crouched barefoot in the backyard garden with her knees digging into the soft earth. The scent of tomato vines and crushed basil filled the summer air. Sweat beaded along her hairline, the sun baking her shoulders through her thin cotton t-shirt. Beside her, her mother knelt in the dirt, a wide straw hat perched crooked atop her curls, one glove missing from her work-roughened hands. Don't bury it too deep, Katie girl, her mother said, her voice low and melodic, as she cupped her palm over Kate's smaller hand, guiding it to press soil gently over the tender green shoot. Tomatoes need to breathe just like people. Kate smiled, the memory so vivid she could almost feel the heat radiating off the garden bricks. She glanced up, squinting against the sun to see her mother's face. Sweat glistened along her temples, her hair curling damp beneath her hat. She smelled like lavender lotion and loamy soil. Her mother leaned back on her heels, brushing dirt from her knees, and grinned down at Kate with bright, fierce love. "Remember this, baby?" she said, her smile softening as she reached out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind Kate's ear. "No matter what happens, no matter who tries to make you doubt yourself, I will always believe in you. Even if the whole world makes you cry, I will still believe you the most." Tears welled hot in Kate's eyes as the memory dissolved into the dim kitchen around her. She pressed her fingers harder against the glass, as if willing her mother's warmth to seep through to fill the aching hollow in her chest. Outside, a cold wind rattled the balcony railing, sending dry leaves skittering across the cement. Kate exhaled shakily, blinking back tears as she turned away from the window. She opened the small drawer near the sink and pulled out a single white candle. Setting it carefully on the counter before the photograph, she struck a match and held the flickering flame to the wick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small golden flame blossomed, casting flickering shadows up across her mother's smiling face. Kate set the match aside and wrapped her arms around her ribs, holding herself tightly as tears spilled silently down her cheeks. The apartment was silent except for the quiet hiss of the candle burning down. Kate closed her eyes. "I did it, Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking on the syllables. "I kept my promise. I protected what you wanted. I protected what mattered." She reached out her fingertips, trembling as they brushed against the candle's glass holder. The warmth seeped into her skin, small but real, grounding her in the quiet. Outside, the city murmured in distant traffic sounds, the deep bass thrum of passing buses, the low hum of streetlights vibrating against the black velvet sky. She sat there for a long time, knees pulled up to her chest on the kitchen stool, watching the candle's small flame dance and flicker. Shadows rippled across her mother's photograph, making her smile waver and shimmer like something alive. Finally, when the wax burned low, Kate wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve. She stood slowly, her limbs stiff from grief and stillness. Blowing out the candle, she watched the thin gray curl of smoke rise toward the ceiling before dissipating into nothing. She slipped her mother's photograph into her worn canvas bag, wrapping it carefully in an old scarf. Then she walked to the front door, slipping on her boots one by one. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she zipped up her coat and pulled the scarf around her throat. She switched off the light, plunging the apartment into cool twilight shadows. The glow of the streetlights outside spilled across the floorboards, painting long gold rectangles that stretched to her feet. With one last glance around the quiet room, the bare kitchen table, the stack of library books on the windowsill, the empty mug by the sink, she turned and locked the door behind her. The hallway was silent as she stepped out, her boot heels clicking softly on the scuffed linoleum. At the stairwell landing, she paused, resting her hand on the railing. She inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, clearing out the tightness in her chest. She stepped outside into the crisp evening. The cold bit gently at her exposed skin, threading cool fingers through her hair. The street was quiet, only a few cars humming past at intervals, their headlights casting fleeting beams of white across the sidewalk. Kate walked slowly down the block, her scarf pulled up to her chin, her breath fogging in the yellow glow of the street lamps. Above her, the sky was a deep indigo scattered with trembling stars. The breeze lifted strands of her hair, brushing them lightly across her lips. She closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sky, feeling the cold air kiss her skin. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played a soft piano piece through an open cafe door. The notes drifted into the street, curling around her like a lullaby. The melody rose and fell, simple and mournful, dissolving into the night as quickly as it came. Kate smiled, small and tired and real. She kept walking, her boots scuffing softly against the cracked pavement, leaving behind echoes that quickly faded into the quiet. Each step felt lighter than the last, Each breath felt cleaner, and as she disappeared into the golden pools of lamplight dotting the empty street, her shadow stretching out behind her like a path she no longer needed to follow, Kate Turner carried with her only what mattered: a promise kept, a love remembered, and a quiet, unbreakable peace that no one could ever steal away again. The next morning dawned with soft golden light spilling through the slats of Kate's blinds, illuminating the small apartment in a gentle haze. She sat at her tiny kitchen table sipping tea from a chipped porcelain mug, the steam curling upward to warm her tired face. Outside, the city woke slowly. Muffled car engines, distant barking dogs, a mother calling to her child to hurry for school. She finished her tea in silence, rinsed the mug in the narrow sink and dried it with deliberate care before placing it upside down on the rack. Then she grabbed her canvas bag, slipping her wallet and a small wrapped box inside. She pulled on her coat and scarf, pausing by the door to tuck her mother's photograph into her inner pocket, close to her heart. The streets were bathed in pale sunlight as she walked the 5 blocks to St. Agnes Elder Home. A cold breeze rustled the bare branches overhead, making them clack like thin bones against the bright winter sky. Outside the entrance, she paused to buy 3 small bouquets of daisies from a florist cart parked along the curb. The petals were white and yellow and pink, soft against her gloved fingers as she carried them up the stone steps. Inside, the warm smell of oatmeal weak coffee and medicated lotion wrapped around her like an old quilt. The tiled halls echoed with the slow shuffle of slippers and the gentle rumble of wheelchair wheels. Nurses in pastel scrubs moved from room to room, speaking in low voices, adjusting pillows and medication carts. Kate made her way down the hall to the recreation room, where a few residents sat scattered in faded armchairs by the window, watching pigeons flutter across the frozen garden. She approached a small woman with thin white hair coiled in a neat bun, her face lined with the deep grooves of time. A floral blanket was tucked around her legs, and her clouded eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing. "Good morning, Mrs. Alvarez," Kate said softly, crouching beside her chair. The woman's head tilted slightly, her lips parting in a small, absent smile. Kate reached into her bag and pulled out the box she had wrapped that morning. Inside was a small slice of pound cake, its sweet vanilla scent filling the quiet corner of the room. She placed it gently on the table by Mrs. Alvarez's elbow, along with a bunch of daisies tied in raffia ribbon. "I brought you cake today," she continued, her voice low and warm. "And some flowers, too. You told me once daisies were your favorite." The old woman didn't answer, but her smile grew wider, her thin fingers twitching slightly against the blanket. Kate reached out and took her hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and the fragile bones beneath. For a moment they sat in silence, the winter sun pooling golden across the worn carpet around their feet. Kate's chest ached with something that was almost grief, but not quite. It was deeper and quieter, threaded through with warmth. As she looked at the blind woman's milky eyes and felt her fragile fingers curl faintly around her own, a memory bloomed bright in her mind. Her mother's voice in the garden that summer day. "Even if the whole world makes you cry, I will still believe you the most." She blinked against the tears that welled in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice trembled with quiet certainty. "You're not alone," she whispered to Mrs. Alvarez. "I promise. You're not alone." For the next hour, Kate moved through the recreation room, leaving small bouquets and boxes of cake beside wheelchairs and trembling hands. She knelt to adjust a blanket slipping down an old man's legs, tucked a loose strand of hair behind a woman's hearing aid, squeezed a stooped woman's shoulders in gentle greeting. She didn't rush. Each gesture was deliberate, steady, imbued with the soft focus of someone pouring love into every small act. Later that afternoon, she sat in the director's office filling out the volunteer registration forms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly, as she wrote her name in looping cursive, Catherine Louise Turner. The director, a woman in her 50s with short gray curls and horn-rimmed glasses, smiled at her from across the desk. "We're grateful for your help," she said, sliding the forms into a folder. "You have a calm presence. They'll respond well to that." Kate returned her smile, feeling something stir deep in her chest. It was small and tentative at first, like a candle flickering to life in a dark room. But it grew as she stepped out into the brisk afternoon sunlight, buttoning her coat up to her throat against the chill. The feeling spread warm and quiet through her ribs until she realized what it was. Hope. For the first time in years she felt it blooming inside her. Not sharp and desperate like survival, but steady and rooted like faith. Outside the Elder home, her old bicycle waited, chained to a lamppost. Its black paint was chipped in places and the leather seat was cracked, but the tires were full and the gears oiled. She swung her leg over, settling onto the seat, as she adjusted the strap of her canvas bag across her chest. Her scarf fluttered in the cold wind, carrying the faint scent of daisies. She pushed off the curb, pedaling slowly down the quiet street. The late afternoon sun cast long golden slants across the asphalt, painting the faded lane lines in molten light. Her breath fogged in the crisp air, each exhale curling back over her shoulder like smoke. She didn't rush. Her legs moved in slow, even rotations, the pedals creaking softly under her boots. The world passed around her in quiet waves, an old man sweeping his stoop, a boy in a puffy jacket chasing his barking dog, a shopkeeper locking up for the night. As she rode, the breeze lifted her hair, sending it streaming out behind her. It threaded cool fingers through the strands, brushing them gently across her cheeks. She closed her eyes for a brief, fearless moment, feeling the dying sun kiss her closed eyelids with fading warmth. In that moment, there were no courtrooms, no echoing screams, no dark basements filled with smoke and fear. There was only the golden light of dusk, the rhythm of her heartbeat in her chest, the feeling of her mother's photograph pressed close to her ribs like a promise kept. And as she pedaled down the quiet street, the piano music from a passing open cafe door drifted out to meet her. The notes were slow and tender, rising into the dusk like prayer. Kate smiled, her lips curving with quiet certainty. She rode on through the lengthening shadows, her silhouette framed in the soft amber glow of the street lamps, until she disappeared into the gentle hush of evening, leaving behind only the fading echo of bicycle wheels turning in the dusk and the small, unbreakable promise of her healing heart. The sky was an endless sea of midnight blue, scattered with faint trembling stars, when Kate sat down by the window in her small apartment. The radiator hummed quietly against the cold, warming the soles of her feet through thick wool socks. Outside, the city pulsed with quiet light. Amber street lamps, neon diner signs, distant blinking airplane lights, tracing invisible paths across the sky. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. A light ache pulsed through her forearms where the burns and cuts were still healing beneath neat gauze bandages. The sharpest pain had dulled now into something deeper and quieter, a constant throb that reminded her she was alive. She rested her chin on her knees, breathing slowly, letting the silence of the room settle into her bones. The candle flickered on the low table beside her, casting soft, golden shadows up the whitewashed walls. The photo frame stood propped next to it. Her mother's gentle smile caught forever in a candid moment, eyes crinkled in tired love hair, curling in faint wisps around her forehead. Kate closed her eyes, and her voice rose soft and even, echoing through the quiet room like prayer. It vibrated into the wood floor, the plaster walls, into the candle flame itself. Sometimes the ones who betray us are the very people we once trusted with our lives. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, fading quickly into the hush of traffic below. She inhaled slowly, letting the pain curl around her chest without flinching away. But forgiveness is never about them. It's not about their redemption. It's not about proving we are good enough to love them despite what they did. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on the candle flame, its small glow trembling with each shift of air in the room. Forgiveness is freedom. It's the moment we let go of their claws in our chest, so we can finally breathe again. She reached forward, blowing out the candle in a single steady breath. Smoke curled upward in thin gray ribbons, dissipating quickly into the quiet. The faint smell of burnt wick lingered earthy and sweet. She rose slowly from the floor, her knees stiff from sitting so long, and walked to the narrow desk under the window. She pulled out the old cloth-bound journal she had kept hidden in a drawer for years, its spine soft and worn from thumbprints and quiet tears. She settled into the creaking wooden chair, the window glass cool against her cheek, as she leaned toward the dim city glow. She opened the journal to a blank page, smoothing it flat with her bandaged hand. The paper felt thick and heavy under her palm, grounding her in its silent patience. She picked up a pen and held it over the page, her breath coming slow and steady. For a long moment she didn't write. She just sat there, letting the quiet wrap around her like a shawl, feeling the ache in her chest begin to ease, if only by a fraction. Then she began to write. Her script was small but clear, each letter pressed firmly into the paper, deliberate and certain. Words poured from her fingertips like spring water, clean and cold and unflinching. Today I saw her smile again. In every old woman's hands I held in every tired eye that flickered with hope for a moment. I saw her. I am beginning to understand. This is not the end of my story. Or hers. It is only the middle. And for the first time I am not afraid to keep writing it alone. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall onto the page, smudging the ink in soft gray shadows that bled into the paper like memory itself. She signed her name at the bottom of the entry, pressing the pen down so hard the nib nearly tore through the page. Her hand trembled as she set the pen aside, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that rose and fell like distant waves against the shore. She pressed her forehead to the window pane, feeling the cold seep into her skin, anchoring her in the present. Below, the city sparkled under the dark velvet sky. Red taillights streamed down avenues like rivers of molten light. High-rise windows glowed in yellow rectangles, each one a small universe of dinner tables, bedtime stories, late-night laughter, quiet, loneliness. She let out a trembling breath, fogging the glass in a small, fleeting oval. Her gaze drifted to the photograph propped against the candle holder on the desk. Her mother's eyes gazed back at her eternal and knowing smile, caught forever in the quiet dignity of love that asked for nothing in return. The edges of Kate's lips curved upward in a small, tired smile. It was not triumphant. It was not radiant. But it was real. She stood slowly, sliding her journal back into the drawer. She pulled on her wool coat and wound her scarf around her throat, tucking the ends under her collar. Her boots thudded softly against the hardwood as she walked to the door. She paused, flicking off the lamp by the desk. The apartment sank into darkness, except for the faint golden spill of city light filtering in through the thin curtains. She stepped outside into the crisp night air, locking the door behind her with a quiet click. Her bicycle leaned against the railing, its metal frame glowing softly under the amber wash of the street lamp overhead. She swung her leg over, settling onto the cracked leather seat as she adjusted her scarf against the wind. She pushed off the curb, pedaling slowly down the empty street. The breeze lifted her hair, brushing it back from her face. Her breath curled out in small white clouds, dissolving quickly into the quiet. The buildings rose tall and silent around her as she rode, their windows gleaming with quiet life. Shop signs flickered, buses rumbled in the distance, the city's low hum wrapping around her in familiar, comforting vibration. A sliver of moon hung overhead, thin and pale against the dark velvet sky. The breeze pressed cool against her skin, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and pine from distant winter fires. As she rode, the camera would close in on her face, capturing the quiet curve of her lips, the steady certainty in her eyes. Then it would pull back, rising higher and higher above the lamplit street, capturing her small figure gliding down the empty avenue framed by rows of golden windows and the glittering wash of city lights. The piano music would rise softly beneath the hum of tires on cracked asphalt, a melody tender and bright, echoing with hope and something like absolution. And in that final fading frame, as the camera rose into the quiet night sky, the city glowing below like a living constellation, her mother's voice would echo one last time, threaded through Kate's memory, with a love that death could never silence. Even if the whole world makes you cry, I will always believe you the most. Fade out. Morning arrived in soft golden hues, seeping gently through the gauzy cream curtains and bathing the small kitchen in muted light. The quiet hum of the city beyond her window sounded almost like a lullaby this early. Distant delivery trucks rumbling down cracked asphalt, the fluttering coo of pigeons on fire escapes, the wind whispering faintly between brick buildings. Kate stood barefoot by her narrow kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. Steam curled upward in thin, lazy spirals from the dark coffee within, carrying with it the earthy, bittersweet scent that always reminded her of home. She closed her eyes and lifted the mug to her lips, inhaling deeply before taking a slow, deliberate sip. The heat bloomed across her tongue, spreading down her throat and into her chest, pooling there like liquid courage. Her shoulders relaxed. The tight knot between her ribs loosened just slightly, just enough to let in the quiet peace of this small, ordinary moment. A piano melody drifted from the old radio perched on her windowsill, a song her mother used to hum under her breath while folding laundry or rinsing vegetables in the cracked farmhouse sink. The notes rose and fell in gentle waves, threading through the sunlight and settling deep in Kate's bones. She could almost hear her mother's voice singing softly beneath the melody, her tone warm and rich despite its weariness. Though shadows may fall, the sun always rises. A small, tired smile tugged at Kate's lips as she set her mug down on the counter, the ceramic clinking gently against the worn wood. She pressed her palms flat against the cool surface, closing her eyes as the music wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. The scent of brewing coffee, the golden light her mother's favorite song. For the first time in years, she felt truly, wholly safe. When the final notes faded into quiet static, Kate drew in a long, slow breath and exhaled it shakily. She wiped a tear from the corner of her eye with the back of her hand, smiling to herself at its unexpected warmth. She turned to her small second-hand laptop sitting open on the tiny kitchen table, its silver surface dappled with morning sun through the lace curtains. The email inbox blinked softly on the dim screen, a small red dot indicating one unread message. Her heart quickened as she pulled out the chair and sat down, her knees brushing the underside of the table. She tucked her hair behind her ears with trembling fingers and clicked open the email. The subject line read, "Community Library Manager Position, Offer Letter." For a moment her breath caught painfully in her throat. Her eyes darted across the lines of text, scanning for the words her heart already knew were there. "We are pleased to inform you. Impressed with your dedication. Welcome you to our team as Community Library Manager. Orientation begins next Monday." Begins. A ragged sob tore from her chest, sudden and unbidden. Tears spilled down her cheeks, warm and salty, dripping onto the keyboard below. Her shoulders shook as quiet laughter bubbled up through her tears, rising like sunlight breaking through early morning fog. She pressed her trembling fingers to her lips, stifling the choked laugh that escaped her chest. Relief and gratitude flooded her so completely that her body felt impossibly light, as though her ribs were hollowed out to make room for this fierce, burning joy. She reached out and traced the words on the screen with her fingertips, feeling their certainty settle into her bones like a vow: you are good enough, you are strong enough, you belong. Outside the window, a small sparrow flitted down to perch on the rusted fire escape railing, its tiny chest puffed out as it chirped 3 bright, defiant notes into the cold winter air before darting off into the sky. Kate watched it disappear into the brightening morning, her tears still falling freely, silent and unashamed. She closed the laptop softly, the small click echoing in the quiet kitchen. For a moment, she simply sat there, her breathing ragged, her heart thudding against her ribs with something that felt like hope, pure and certain and undeniable. Slowly, she stood. Her knees trembled as she stepped to the window, pressing her palms against the cold glass. The city stretched out before her in wide golden bands, rooftops gleaming in the newborn sun. Steam rose from metal vents curling upward in thin silver ribbons that faded into the clear, pale sky. The streets below filled with early risers, bundled construction workers stomping cold feet at the bus stop, children with neon backpacks trotting to school behind their parents, bakery delivery trucks humming past with sweet, yeasty warmth trailing in their wake. Kate closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the cold air seep through the old window frame and fill her lungs. It smelled of car exhaust and distant river water and crisp morning frost. It smelled like life, like a new beginning. She turned away from the window and grabbed her scarf from its hook by the door. Wrapping it snugly around her neck, she tucked the ends into her coat and slipped on her old leather gloves, scuffed at the palms from bicycle handlebars and garden work. The photo of her mother peeked out from the small cloth pouch tied to her shoulder bag. Kate pressed her fingers against it, feeling its solid, familiar edges beneath the canvas. She opened the door, stepping out into the cold stairwell. Her boots clacked down each worn step as she descended, echoing softly through the quiet building. At the entrance, she paused, letting the morning sun wash across her face. The wind lifted her hair as she stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from the vendor down the block. She swung her leg over her bicycle and settled onto the cracked leather seat. As she pushed off the curb, the wheels hummed against the asphalt, carrying her forward into the golden wash of dawn. The city pulsed around her, alive and glowing. The breeze whipped her hair back from her face, chilling her damp cheeks. But she didn't shiver. She felt only warmth blooming deep in her chest, anchored there like a flame that would never flicker out again. And as the camera pulled back, rising high above the city streets, capturing her small figure, pedaling through wide golden avenues lined with sleeping cars and waking shops, her voice rose soft and certain over the swelling piano score. The road ahead is long, but today I choose to live for myself. Fade out. The screen dissolved to black, and the final piano notes echoed into silence. Then, in simple white serif font against the black, appeared the film's title card, Mother's Light. The music swelled one last time, tender and quiet, before fading away completely, leaving behind only silence and the steady, unbreakable beat of Kate Turner's healing heart.